All right, well, welcome to the last talk from tonight, titled Unlocking the Emotional Brain, which is also the same title of the book where I basically took most of the information from. It's about psychotherapy and some of the more, the newest findings on how to make it actually more effective and some of the principles behind it that also correlate to some of the neuroscientific findings. I found it very helpful and interesting, so I thought I'd share the general ideas with you. But so, generally speaking, what are the reasons you would even consider doing some sort of therapy or self-therapy if you're more of a do-it-yourself kind of guy? I think generally speaking, you only do it if you want to change something. So it's either usually you want to do something, but something holds you back, or the other way around, where you always end up doing some non-productive or self-destructive behavior, and you just can't bring yourself to stop. So generally speaking, if you're happy with your life and you don't find any problems, you're usually not thinking of hitting up the next therapy office. But the problem is it's really hard to do, of course. If you ever done stuff like New Year's resolutions are infamous for people not following through over long periods of time. And so it's really tricky to actually change. And the part of the reason is that if you have a kind of stuff that the learning that is formed while you're either under intense emotion like trauma, or if it's repeated often, it's very durable. It's kind of locked in your brain, and it's kind of not very easy to change. And I use the word learning here because that's what the author often uses. What that means is both the emotional aspect of whatever the problem could be, but also the concept, the whole idea and worldview that goes along with that you might not be aware of. So let's talk about the author real quick, because in the 90s he started this research into how to have more effective therapy, because he had a mentor. So he was working at a family therapy institute, or I don't know what they call it, therapy clinic. I don't actually know the name. And his mentor was very interested in making it more efficient. So that's how he got around thinking about that. Because the problem was, or still is to a degree, that there's a lot of different methods of therapy. But if whenever they try to figure out which is better or which is more effective, it turned around to be around the same. So you don't have a clear, oh, this is really good, this is really bad, where you then could move more in one direction than the other, or at least that used to be true, still I think 10 years ago. And also the effect size overall is not that great. And sometimes, for certain clients, they seem to be impervious to change, regardless of what therapists try. So it's kind of dissatisfying, probably, if you're working professionally in the field, but also just as a customer, it's kind of not that great. So what they did is, in the early 90s, they looked at a lot of transcripts from their own patients or from others, where they looked at these moments in therapy where actual change happened, where you have this significant shift in a patient or a client, where they actually had a breakthrough event that actually led to permanent change for them. And they wanted to figure out, is there are there any common factors that... Did the mic just go off? All right, okay, then it just sounds weird to me. Okay, never mind, sorry about that. So they were looking, are there any common factors, basically, that were always present when the breakthrough occurred, and then with the goal that, yes, if they are, that they can try and make a therapy based on that to facilitate that more often, or just basically that they know to begin with what works and what doesn't. Which they did, and they started a therapy called depth-oriented breath therapy, which then later got renamed. They had some really good success with that, and they're still teaching that. Now they renamed it to coherence therapy, in case you want to look on that up, because the whole brief part, people thought that meant it's very shallow, and so they kind of discarded it just based on the name. So it had a bit of a branding issue, funny enough, but... But the other cool thing is then in the 2000s, neuroscientists who weren't really looking at therapy in general found a new type of neuroplasticity they call memory reconsolidation, that also actually found the same principles that Ecker found in his 90s study with people on how how the brain can change its wiring, which up to that point was not known. And so I found that pretty cool, because it's like the first time that at least I'm aware of where therapy and like neuroscience like goes together in such a nice way that they both independently come to like similar results. So let's just really quickly look memory reconsolidation from like how a neuroscientist found it out and what that means. So from a neuroscientific, they have like a bit of an easier task, because they don't, when they try to like quote unquote rewire people's brains or sometimes animals' brains, they don't have to guess what's in there, because they like usually they implant something like themselves, so they know what they're looking for. So what they then have to do to change it, they found, is reactivate the original learning, meaning the original like behavior they either taught the human to react to subconsciously, or the animal. Then there's like they found around a 5-hour window where after reactivating it, it's open to being revisioned by new experience, which then, if the new experience was incompatible with the old one, usually the original one would then get revised or erased as it then got locked in place again, which would then change kind of the previously unconscious learning. Now, in therapy, that's basically, it's similar, except it needs some extra steps. As I said, you don't know first, I mean, if you're doing cell therapy, or if you're, well, no one's here a therapist, so I skipped that part, but you got to find out first is like, what are you actually looking for when does whatever symptom occur? And then the really hard part is figuring out what's actually like going on subconsciously first, and retrieve that. And this has to be very experientially done. You cannot, it's not a thing like some therapists do where you theorize about it, or you're like guessing, or you're coming up with ideas. You kind of have to wait to actually really trigger it again, and just figure out what's going on inside, I guess inside yourself. And we'll see a more clear example how that goes later. And you gotta, because it's like a new like, again, as these learnings are usually unconscious, which is why they're hard to change. You gotta also integrate it more into like everyday awareness, like figuring out what was that. After you've uncovered it, also like basically keep it in the present awareness more. But again, we'll see more details on the example later. And then that's the same then again as in neuroscience. You find something that, an experience that's incompatible with it, which would then erase or revise the original thing. And usually what you want to do is like a verification step, just to figure out, like trying to re-trigger the original problem or symptom and see if it still actually triggers or if it's gone. But so from the book, I just took basically the one of the examples that Bruce Ecker gave with a patient, and I just transcribed most of it a little bit so that we can see all that abstract stuff, what that means in concrete form, and it's probably more helpful then to understand how that could work. So again, what they need to do, first they figure out symptom identification. So the patient in this case is called Richard, and he's, I think, a technical engineer, but he has this really strong self-doubt about his abilities, that even though his knowledge is good, but he kind of just, he always doubts his own abilities and knowledge. So he reports to the therapist thoughts like, oh, who am I to think what's right, or this could be wrong, and all these like, maybe some people know that, like these kind of like internal thoughts that create self-doubt. And as a result, he never can express himself during meetings. And well, that's what he goes to the therapist for, because he wants to change that. So that would have been the first step for the therapist to figure out what the symptoms are and when they occur. So now the second step, basically the tricky one, is figuring out why basically it occurs and what's there subconsciously that causes it. And in this particular case, they use a technique called symptom deprivation, And the idea is that he wants to get Richard to imagine himself in the situation without, like, basically without him being doubtful, like to imagine himself being very confident, so that the idea is that there's usually another underlying cause that makes him want to avoid speaking out confidently. That creates the symptom of him doubting himself. So by removing the doubting, he basically wants to figure out what the other distress is that's underlying. But I just want to say, like, this is the particular technique they use in this case, but this is very, like, how do you say it, open to other techniques. Yeah, okay, so yeah, they tried to figure out the underlying problem. So as I said a bit earlier, the important thing is you do it experientially. Like you don't theorize about it. They try to get the direct emotional experience and then kind of basically take the knowledge directly out of there, as opposed to, say, going back and asking him about his childhood and coming up with ideas that could match, or ignoring the contents completely, as some examples that other types of therapies occasionally do it. So that's why what he's doing is he has Richard actually imagine him being in a meeting and making some useful comments, and so that he really gets the feeling of being there, and the emotion gets triggered as it is in its form. So here's some of the transcript. Also, just want to say real quick, I'm going to read it through because the text is there anyway, so you would just probably get distracted if I don't. You're going to read it anyway. That's what I would do, at least. In therapy, the therapist, it's described better, he's more empathetic and he's more soft-spoken. I will just basically go through it, but it will make a bit of a mismatch maybe of the original voice and me, but yeah. It's going to be fine. So Richard says, so he has imagined himself being in a meeting, making the comment. So Richard says, now I'm feeling really uncomfortable, but in a different way, right? So usually he would just doubt himself, and now it's different. So the therapist just asks him, okay, let yourself feel it, this different discomfort, and see if any words come along with this uncomfortable feeling. So he's trying to figure out, or get Richard to figure out what's going on inside him. And so after a while, he's like, now they hate me. And so the therapist goes on, now they hate me, good, keep going. See if this really uncomfortable feeling also can tell you why they hate you. And so Richard, after another pause, he's like, it's because now I'm an arrogant asshole, like my father, totally self-centered, totally insensitive, know-it-all. So this all just comes out basically, quote-unquote, out of nowhere, right? But it's just from the re-triggering of the original emotion, where you can pretty quickly get to that stuff sometimes. So he's asking again, do you mean having a feeling of confidence as you speak turns you into an arrogant asshole like that? And Rich is like, yeah, exactly, wow. And so he asked him, how do you feel about being like him in this way? And Richard says, well, it's horrible, it's always what I vowed not to be, right? So this is what I alluded to earlier about. So here is the underlying cause that made him doubt his own ability to begin with, right? The underlying distress that he tried to avoid experiencing all the time, that he wasn't consciously aware of. So again, we have experiential knowledge from the client side, direct experience coming from his own emotions. The therapist completely avoided any interpretation on his own, which is really good because again, he also basically doesn't know what's going on in other people. It'll be like you don't have a telescope going inside the brain of other human beings. Making as few assumptions as possible, basically just go with whatever you find. Don't assume it's going to lead you one way or another way. You also try to avoid fix or correct anything. There was no pushback. Often it's like you would think, the first reaction is always but that's obviously crazy, how can you think that, right? But none of that, right? You're just trying to figure out the contents of the subconscious part. That you don't try to push it back, that would just kind of go against the purpose. And this is generally called the pro-symptom position. because it's like it assumes the symptom has a point, right? So that it fulfills an important purpose. In this case, we've seen that the purpose is to avoid that he thinks, like, to avoid being like his dad, who was this arrogant person. So now the second part, as I said, so integration, right? So this was obviously during a special session in a therapist's office. You close your eyes, you imagine, you re-trigger the situation. This is not something you normally do. So unless you do go through some steps to integrate that into more everyday awareness, it's just going to get lost again and going back into subconscious. So what they try to do is to create the form of like repeated exposure for themselves by making an overt statement, like just some simple 1 or 2 sentences that captures the emotion and the content the most accurate, and then to give them a card to read over the next few weeks. So here they're just trying to find a good statement that works for them, that feels true. So the therapist just asks, let's see if this feels true, to say the sentence. Feeling any confidence means I'm arrogant, self-centered, and totally insensitive like that, and people will hate me for it. So I've got to never feel confident ever. And I'm going to talk a bit about the language they use here, because again, you see that's not like everyday language either. And so Rachel just repeats the exact same sentence. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's the same. So he asks, does this feel true to you and your body? Just to make sure, like, it resonates. And he's like, oh yeah, my body is buzzing with how true that feels, right? So you kind of experience yourself if you're just like going off on a tangent on your own, or if it's actually resonating with what's really there subconsciously. And so he just asked him also, like, a few minutes ago you seemed surprised that by getting in touch with this, realizing you have a powerful purpose for not getting anywhere near feelings of confidence. And so Richard is like, yeah, it's kind of a relief to, I feel so screwed up at work, and I thought that's just how I am. So that's also kind of a relief usually, to see it's not just some random, like, how do you call it? Like a problem, or some random, like, defect that people have usually, like that there's like some point behind it. Even if it's often based on like inaccurate assumptions. So as I said, the phrasing they tried to get at is like something very like vivid, first person, as specific as you can, right? So you want to bring about the emotional quality of the content. Again, we don't want to think about if it makes sense or like objectively, rationally. At this point, you just want to actually accurately describe what is really going on. As opposed to everyday language, which would just rather minimize it, intellectualize it, and kind of, distance yourself from it to try to like rationalize it. So in everyday language, the same sentence would sound like maybe something like, people won't like it if you're too confident in what you say to them, so it's good to be careful, which is true, but it's very weak at accessing any emotional content of it. And so any transformational change would probably not happen with such a weak statement, because it won't re-trigger the actual emotion. It will just be like a distant descriptor of things instead. So as I said, what they do is they gave him a card, like some like, you can put in your like vest pocket or something, and you just like once or twice a day read it again to integrate it into the everyday awareness. So 2 weeks later, so they had another session a week in between just to check up, but 2 weeks later, Richard has this experience where he says, this week, so I was in a technical meeting at work and I thought of a good solution to a problem being discussed, but then I went into, what do I know, and kept quiet, right? So they didn't do anything so far to actually address the symptom, like to change it. It was just about integration. So he's still in that mode, basically. And then he says, but a moment later, somebody else spoke up and suggested the same solution, and he said it pretty confidently. That jolted me, and I immediately looked up around the room. And then I saw that everybody seemed glad to get this useful solution from this other guy. And it was weird how different it went from how I expected it to go if I had said it confidently like he said. So he basically got this mismatching experience on its own without doing, like the therapist doing anything in that regard. But so now that they have something to work with, the therapist goes, okay, so would you be willing to conjure up that scene at work in your mind's eye for a few minutes with me guiding to try a few things? The moment you revisit that point during the meeting when you've had squelched your idea to keep from being hated like that, because any expressing of confidence makes you resemble him, just be back in touch with that in your body in that seat to whatever degree you can. Right, so here they start the first step, reactivating the original learning, again, with a very direct emotional re-triggering, so to speak, and he gets him to really be in that situation. So he says, okay, stay with that. Stay with being surprised at what you're seeing. Surprised because in your life you've had such a definite knowing that saying something confidently to people will always come across like that, like an obnoxious know-it-all, and people will hate that. That's what you know. Yet at the same time, here you're seeing that saying something confidently isn't always like that, and then people are fine with it, and it's quite a surprise to know that. So here he's doing the mismatching, right? So he reactivated very consciously the original learning that Richard, right, the one 2 weeks ago in that time, he learned, and he holds up this other experience he just had, in his office. So he asked, okay, does it feel true to describe it like that? Your old knowing right alongside this other new knowing, that's so different. So we just go like, yeah. So he asks again, all along it seemed that saying something confidently could be done only in that dominating way of doing it, and now suddenly you're seeing that saying something confidently can be done very differently, and it feels fine to people, right? So he again tries to bring into awareness the two different experiences and juxtaposing them. So now he asks him, how is it for you to be in touch with both of these knowings? The old one telling you that anything said with confidence means being like that, and the new one that knows you can be confident in a way that feels okay with people. And so yeah, he's juxtaposing it again, and he asks him for what he thinks about it, right? So that he can be aware of that and think about it, right? And be aware of the two contradictory worldviews. So Rich is like, oh, it's sort of weird. It's like there's this part of the world that I didn't notice before, even though it's been right there. So the therapist asks him on that, oh, I'm intrigued by how you put that. Sounds like a significant shift for you. And he's like, yeah, it is. And so he asks him again, so you're seeing both now, the old part of the world and this other new part that's new, even though it was right there all along. So again, he mismatches and juxtaposes these both experiences. So now we go, so keep seeing both, the old part and the new part. When you open your eyes in a few seconds, come back to the room with me. Can you keep seeing both? And he's like, yeah. And so now he asks him, so what it's like to see both and feel both of these incompatible experiences? And so here's where, yeah, so the laughter part is actually pretty, it's kind of funny. It seems to happen a lot. Like you have this really huge problem, but once you actually experientially mismatch it in hindsight, I don't know, laughter seems to happen a lot. You wouldn't think it, but it seems, so anyway, he laughs a bit and he's kind of, oh, it's kind of funny, like what, how could I even think that? And so the therapist is asking him, do you mean how could you think that simply saying what you know or mentioning some good idea you've had would make you seem arrogant, insensitive, and dominating like your dad and be hated for it? And he's like laughing again, it's like, yeah. So that was basic examples. Again, this was over like 3 weeks, and I think the week afterwards they just checked again to see if if it still holds. But basically that was the whole like transformation from like basically his lifelong doubting at work to the whole thing being basically gone in very few seconds. And that's usually not what, like, you can have problematic steps along the way, of course. That's a very smooth example even by this standard. But it shows well like how the basic steps go. So again, to summarize again, so they identify the target learning and retrieve it, which is the original like unconscious, like in that case, that he thinks he's arrogant and being hated like that if he shows confidence. Integrate it into everyday awareness. Then find an experience after you trigger it, right, as you re-trigger the old knowing that you integrated. Find an experience that mismatches it, and which will raise it. Now the cool thing is about that, it's technique-independent principles. Like those are the steps that are necessary to change old like structures in your brain and erase them or revise them to new ones. However, how you uncover the original learning, or like how you figure out what's going on in your subconscious. Or this is all very technique independent. So like if you're used to like if you've done some cell therapy or you've used other techniques, like the technique used here was symptom deprivation, right? But if you're used to something else that works for you, like go with whatever works for you. Basically, it's not important what you particularly use to get to the underlying emotion and the content. It's just which makes it rather flexible, I think, and very useful. And as I said earlier, also it's the first thing I know that actually correlates to some neuroscientific findings that kind of confirm that this is the way the brain can rewire itself, which is pretty cool. And which also would explain why it's an effective way to potentially change behavior, emotions, or thought. And I say potentially because occasionally you don't, as I said, you don't want to start with an assumption that necessarily the content is defective. Occasionally you also find like really good reasons why you feel or act that way that you like weren't aware of, and then you don't want to change it all, and it makes sense, right? So it's again something where as you're in the discovery period of what's going on, you shouldn't have assumptions that it's defective to begin with. But yeah, I found this very helpful also in my own life, and it saves a lot of time compared to other stuff that I tried, which is the cool thing about it. And yeah, it's very simple in its principles, and the book goes probably there's some more details here and there that I didn't want to throw around randomly because I don't know who is that depthly interested in that. But definitely there's videos on YouTube and stuff if you want to check it out or want to learn more about it. And maybe, next time maybe you think you want to change something about yourself. Now you have some guidelines as to what is necessary to actually rewire your own, wiring. So that was it. The end. All right, cool, thanks.